Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Psychosocial hazards are now recognized as one of the most significant and complex risks facing modern workplaces. But what do they actually look like in practice? And how can organizations address them in meaningful and effective ways? In this episode, we unpack real-world case studies and discuss how factors such as workload, role clarity, leadership, culture, and organizational change can affect mental health, well-being, and performance at work. We will discuss what good practice really looks like and where organizations commonly get stuck and how to move beyond a compliance mindset. Dana Carver is our guest today, a principal at the research and evaluation firm Scarlatti. She has over 25 years' experience in social research, organizational design, and well-being. For the past 5 years, her focus has been on helping organizations identify, assess, and mitigate psychosocial risk. Dana is also the co-creator and chair of the Goods Programs Trust, home of the award-winning Good Yarn program, which has seen over 20,000 people educated in mental health literacy. Welcome, Dana.
Thank you, Angela.
So, to kick us off, maybe let's start with what got you into this field of psychosocial risk management?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's actually coming up on over 30 years now that I've been in this space. So in the early 90s, basically got a degree in psychology, was very interested in workplace health. At that point, it wasn't a thing. And so trudged along in that area for years. And probably in the early 2000s, it started to become much more common to think about how health, both physical and mental, are affected by work and how they affect work. So I've really been in this space forever. I've always been interested in health and human behavior, but particularly where do we spend the most time of our life, our waking life? At work. So it's just exciting to see that the world is finally on board saying, hey, how do we improve our health at work? It's exciting times.
Oh, and maybe just to kind of get us all on the same page, what is the definition of a psychosocial hazard in the context of a workplace?
Yeah, I guess that there is a long answer. I'm going to give you the short answer because everybody just kind of signs off halfway through the long definition. So it's basically the way that work is designed and managed that has the potential to cause harm to workers' health and well-being. So the key point there is it's the way that work is designed and managed. So I think in the past, we've thought about workplace well-being as fruit bowls and step challenges and green smoothies and thinking about if we can help our people be healthy, then more likely we're going to have workplace well-being. But this is a complete shift and I believe the right way to go, which is let's instead look at how we're designing and managing work that may be causing risks.
So how many types of psychosocial hazards are there in the workplace?
Yeah, so there's not like a cut and dry answer. Every regulatory body in every country will say something slightly different. For example, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, I can't remember exactly, that WorkSafe first came out with some guidelines, and there were over 70 hazards mentioned in that one. The latest one came out, probably had over 50. We work with 36. Because a lot of them overlap. And so you've got that challenge of being comprehensive, but also not overwhelming people. So my best answer to that is around 35.
Yeah, we provide a wider screening tool and we've tried to condense it even further just to kind of pick up these bigger groups, and we use 18 on our end. So it's exactly as you said, like it's really trying to capture what are the most common ones that people can shine a spotlight on. So what are the most common hazards in your experience, out of your 36 that you guys review?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I want to say is common doesn't actually mean common only means the most frequent if it depends how you look at it, right? So for us, the way that we look at it is are they happening a lot and how much harm are they causing? Okay, so I just want to explain a lot of people only look at frequency. We look at both frequency and intensity. So when you're looking at both of those, is a different answer than just frequency. So if we go with common as far as frequency, it's almost always poor communication and also probably faulty equipment. If you look at the most intense, though, the ones causing the most harm, you're looking more at the bullying and harassment. But bullying and harassment is not the most common. So it's a tricky question.
Mm-hmm. And so in that context, what is the framework that you advise workplaces use to prioritize? Should they prioritize the thing that affects most people, like the poor communication, or should they prioritize the ones that affect a smaller group of people, but in a much more intense way, like bullying?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is where it's really tricky. And the bigger your organization is and the more role groups you have, they're all going to have different risks. So if you're a big organization, I will answer that question, but just a little context. If you're a big organization, you're not going to have the same risks for everybody. Somebody in an administrative role versus a manual labor role versus executive role are going to have different risks, right? So the very first thing that you need to do is make sure that you check with everybody has a chance to say whether they're experienced to the hazard and whether if they are it is causing them stress and how much stress. And then at that point you can get a dashboard. Like we didn't have a tool years ago, but we found the only way to really know is to have a tool that shows you a dashboard and it'll show you your hotspots. And remember, it's bringing them together. So if a group comes out as high risk, this means that is where you focus. It means you're seeing it, just the right algorithm or wrong algorithm, depends how you look at it, of intensity and risk. So basically you want to answer that question more clearly, what this algorithm will do is tell you which risk is causing the most harm for the most people. And that's usually where you want to start. But you really need a dashboard or something to help you with it because it can be tricky.
How would you define psychosocial risks?
The risk, it's a hazard because it could happen. When it starts to happen more and more, it becomes a higher risk, right? But this is where it's tricky. If it's not causing people a lot of stress, then it's not as much of a risk as something else that's causing. Because remember, the risk is harm, right? So that harm is caused by frequency and intensity. So you have to find the ones that are doing both.
Perfect. And another way to kind of think about it, for example, in the physical world is, for example, wearing seatbelts. You not wearing a seatbelt is considered a hazard, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a risk that you're immediately going to have harm happen to you. But if you drive every day versus if you drive once a year, the odds of you being harmed by not wearing a seatbelt increases because the frequency increases.
If you take a psychosocial risk, like let's say continuous exposure to people and the need to respond to them, right? Some people might not find that very stressful and others would. So psychosocial hazards are a little bit trickier than physical hazards because the intensity will differ per person.
Exactly. And then sort of another common example would be if you think about how do you manage the workload of your people, and for one individual that might be too much work and they are being overwhelmed and stressed by it. And for another person, there's not enough work and they're feeling understimulated, which is a different type of hazard. And so that's all things that makes psychosocial hazards tricky because they're very individualized as well in terms of the impact they have on people. So can all psychosocial hazards be, once you sort of picked up in an organization, okay, here are some of the trends, here are the hazards that are affecting people. Can we always eliminate them or can we only just manage them? How do you assess which category they fall under?
I would say in the majority of the time you can't eliminate them. For example, shift work often is what is required for a job. We do a lot of work with dairy farmers here in New Zealand, and one of the top risks is unsocial hours. And that's because the cows have to be milked on the weekends, and that is part of the job. So I would say in most cases, they can't be eliminated. Like there are going to be risks to work. And so then you move to the management, and management comes in two ways. I think this is really important. It's very similar to physical health. So you can manage it by minimizing the frequency, right? So if we use that working on the weekends example, is if you could give people one weekend off a month, the risk is still there, right? but you've minimized the frequency. If you can't do that, then you need to look at if you can manage or reduce the harm, which means so that the harm doesn't affect them as much. So you could have pizzas on a Friday night and celebrate the Friday night. Those kind of things. So most hazards we are finding have to be managed by either minimizing or reducing, but I'm finding minimizing the frequency is more common than people realize, or more possible.
One of the examples you and I had talked about was in the context of elimination. And you talked about the one where you just had to shift when people can take a break. Share with us that example of an elimination.
The reason I love this one is it's a quick fix that didn't cost a lot of money and made big change. You don't always find them, but it was a group of factory workers whose top risk came out inflexible work hours. Now, alone, that didn't mean a lot, but when we unpacked it and talked to them, basically most of them were mothers, and what they wanted was to be able to check in with their children between 3 and 3:30 every day, but their break fell at 2:00. So all we had to do was move their break to be able to make a call between 3 and 3:30. And if they do that, then the risk is minimized. And to be honest, I would say it's eliminated. We've eliminated the issue that they can't get a hold of their children between 3 and 3:30. So it's a really cool story.
Exactly. And so you've eliminated it in the context that it only really matters to them. It was inflexible in that small window where they needed to check in with their child. But if the flexibility is created in that window, then you remove the other impacts, so which is pretty cool. So when we talk about psychosocial risk management, is it really just a nice to have? It's companies who want to create a feel-good culture, or how does it relate to the health and safety legislation?
Yeah. It is a legal requirement. It's right there in the act. But the question is depending on what country, whether it's being audited, whether it's being enforced, that kind of thing. But in New Zealand, the 2015 Health and Safety Act states that we must provide what's reasonably practical protection for people against workplace harm, both mental and physical. That's what it says. It's just most people focus on the physical. And that's not to say that, organizations are bad. Like one of the psychosocial risks is that we're all a bit overworked. And so then this just is another thing to do. And I think that irony really needs to be recognized. But legally, we are responsible for knowing what things are causing harm to our people, both mental and physical, and then at deciding whether we can eliminate, minimize, or reduce. It is, we must do that.
Absolutely. And the consequences are a little bit higher in Australia, where basically directors and even just your HR manager, you can't sort of say that you have corporate insurance and therefore you can abdicate your duties. They will come after you, whether it's depending on how serious, whether it's a fine or even jail time. So there are very real implications to actually fulfilling your obligations in the law. So what is the employer's responsibility?
So the first thing is you need to show that you did identify the risks and you worked with some employees to do that. You don't have to have worked with all, but the better the representation, the more the better. So you need to show that you identified. Then you need to show that you looked at each of the ones that were present and you decided whether you could eliminate, minimize. And then you tried some things that are reasonably practicable. So if they're not reasonably practical, meaning they would cost so much it would put the business under or things like that, you may not have had to do them. But also it depends what kind of how much pain or harm were they causing, right? So once you've decided what to do, you need to show that you put some things in place. And then here's the real kicker is that you need to be monitoring whether they're making any difference. And we suggest you if you've got the time to have somebody constantly getting feedback, that's great. But if you don't, then within 6 months, you need to do something somewhat formal and just go out and talk to people, ask them if it's made a difference. You could do a survey, but you could have survey fatigue. It could be just chatting to a few people, but you've got to monitor. And if it doesn't seem to be working, try something different. So that is what they want to see that you're doing.
And maybe, I guess, Dana, just to kind of make it clearer for our audience, what are the key stages of the psychosocial risk management?
Yeah, so identify and then assess. So the assess is identifying. So once you've identified what is occurring, it's assessing the intensity, and then it's assessing whether you can eliminate, minimize. And then after assessing, you need to put mitigations in place. That's the third step. And after putting mitigations in place, you have to monitor whether they're working. So 4 steps.
Great. And I guess not every company is mature in this journey. What are the warning signs that they really should get on top of it?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. So, the first thing is like every organization has psychosocial risks. That is one of the clear things that WorkSafe says. Like there's no way you don't have a psychosocial risk. So it's not about waiting for warning signs. It's about making sure that you have identified them and got on top of them ahead of time. However, to answer your question, the warning signs can be a number of different things. It could be turnover. You could find in exit interviews that there are certain trends around workplace relationships or bullying that are coming out. But the other, it's just noise. Like you will see it. There will be noise in certain areas around certain things. But what most people don't understand is that's about looking at harm, not engagement. So engagement surveys, just because someone's engaged with work and enjoying it doesn't mean they aren't experiencing things that are creating harm. So that's just an important thing I wanted to make.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's really important to flag that a lot of companies do engagement, do run at least annual engagement surveys, and they think that that's all that's required, but you have to recognize that engagement surveys are not quite fit for purpose because they're not designed to ask the questions that picks up, all the underlying hazards in an organization. Okay. So as you said that there is often the easiest way to deal with all that complexity is to have a dashboard that helps with prioritizing. Ideally, what is the risk that affecting the most number of people with the highest negative impact on our people? Do you have like a framework that you think about, even if you don't have a dashboard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's two, you're talking about identifying and assessing. So we just have to separate them for a moment, right? So there's a number of different ways to identify. The bigger your organization is, the harder it is to do without a tool. But it all comes down to resource, like how much resource you have. So if you can sit down and talk to everybody, that you don't need a tool, but then you've got to take all that and find the trends, remember? So then you got to take all the information you get that in the background to find the trends. So that's why a tool can be helpful. But I just want to say that a tool has to be done with the right resource, the right support. It's not just something you send out like in an email and expect people to fill it out. You need to make sure it doesn't overlap with an engagement survey. So I just want to say that. But if you have a tool or you meet with people in a group and you come up with your risks, once you've done that, then the way you assess it is to talk to people. Now, we do use a tool for what we call sensitive hazards, but we suggest the best thing to do is, okay, we're seeing that with this group of people, we have medium risks that are, for example, poor communication and inflexible work hours. Can you guys tell us more about this? Those are fairly safe to unpack in a group. People might say, oh, we're in a regional office. We don't get the comms the same as a national office, things like that. But there's some sensitive hazards, things like workplace bullying or conflicting interpersonal relationships, poor pay and reward. Some of those, it's just awkward and really unsafe for us to have people unpack those as a group. So in that case, you can use further assessment tools that further dig down into it and show you what the next step is.
Yeah, one of the interesting conversations we've also had in the context of poor pay, for example, is you often think that if your employees are identifying poor pay as the impact, that it's just because you haven't paid them enough. But one of the further questions you ask is whether it's because the work hasn't paid you fairly or whether it's just your lifestyle choices means that you need a higher pay than what is a fairly compensated pay for the role. Do you want to share a little bit more about the thinking behind that?
Yeah, so it's just there's 7 different options. So if if this did come out for a group of people as a high risk, it just digs down deeper. And there's several things. So is it because you feel someone doing less work than you is getting paid more, for example? Or is it that you feel like other people in other roles similar to you are getting paid more than you? Or do you feel like due to your tenure? So you get the idea. And then the first 6 options are all work related. The 7th option, though, is it just that the job is paying you what you deserve and what matches market rates, but it just doesn't match your current lifestyle? And we've been blown away how many people have picked that. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't stressed by it. It doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong, but there's not a lot an organization can do about that in situations. And so we have had a couple organizations where because over 70% of people that said this was a risk said that was it. Well, they can't eliminate that. They have no control over that. But what they could do, even though it's not necessarily the organization's fault, they can reduce the harm by providing some financial management courses for people, right? So that's just a good example of how you have to unpack these just identifying whether they're high risk or not is not enough.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, Clearhead's an EAP provider. One of the other holistic support we provide is financial advisors for that very reason, because financial stress is the top three stressor or trigger for mental health challenges. And if you can tackle the root cause, it's really key. A lot of what we talked about seems very straightforward, seems very logical, makes sense why the regulators would want us to do this basic minimum. But what are the misconceptions out there about psychosocial risk management?
Oh, I mean, the first thing is that I think people think that it's a gray area and that you cannot separate home from work. And I get that and I understand. But we are at a point where these tools really work to help us figure out where work is causing health issues versus health on work. So I think there's this misconception that you can tell the difference. I'm not saying they don't overlap. So that's a real positive, I think, that that psychosocial risk framework can do that. But I want to be realistic. This doesn't mean that it's simple. I mean, we have worked with a number of different orgs that is a different size. And the bottom line is you've got to have commitment and resource to do this well. And if you don't, you could cause more harm. And that is something that is hard to say because I'm worried people won't get started, and we have to get started on this. So it creates a conundrum. But if there isn't a commitment, which means capability, capacity, and budget to some degree to follow through with this, you could create more harm. And I think we have to be talking about that. I think it's really important.
Let's explore that further. So let's say someone's in an organization where the management team has done the work around identifying these hazards, and maybe they even shared it with the wider company. But then getting the management team to actually deal with this beyond just, we've done the work of assessing what hazards are existing in the organization. Like you said, the commitment to budget and putting in controls, etc., which we'll talk about a bit later. How do you help organizations get management ready to be committed, both from a money, time, resource?
Yeah, so I can only speak to what we do. So we decided 3 years ago that we won't work with organizations who aren't willing to get their people, the leaders. And that's different for every organization. It might be people and culture leader and the CEO. It might be the whole exec team. Sometimes it's the board, but whoever they think are the right people for us to talk to. And we work with them for an hour to show them, at a minimum, it can be more, to show them what needs to be in place and say, are you ready for this journey? It's only what's reasonably practical, but are you going to give people the FTE to do this? And even more important, when are you going to put at least something in place for most risk groups or something for the organization? Because even though lack of trust in the organization might feel like a minor harm to some people, I disagree it's minor, but some people feel that way, it just could have put you backwards. So you've got to make sure you implement things. I guess the second way that we can help is we train people on how to deliver the results, because this is where the second harm comes. You've got to I watch managers get the results, and then, because it's all anonymous the way we do it, but they'll be like, really? And I know, we're all human. I get that totally. I've even been there myself, but you've got to make sure whoever's delivering the results and unpacking with them has the soft skills necessary and the maturity to react properly to these results and unpack them well. So those are the two things: follow through and compassionate results delivery. Two things, and you can train organizations and you can make sure they have them ahead of time.
Do you assess that, as you said, ahead of time, whether the leadership actually believes in the importance of the work, or whether they're just ticking a box? How do you determine who you want to work with?
I would say that the commitment comes in basically putting your money where your mouth is. I don't just mean money though. Okay. Right. So people, and the other thing is, I don't really see many just ticking it. I just see people overworked and exhausted, executive teams so tired. And this is just one more thing they have to do. And so they mean it at the beginning. They mean they're committed and they mean to put the resources, but they just didn't understand what it entailed. And then it fizzes away. I don't see the meaning to do that. So now it's about actually showing people timelines and explaining, when you start it, you need to make sure you do something within this time frame. It can be as small as this. We provide people with comms as well. I'm sure there's other consultants doing that. Here's the comms you use. There's so many tools you can do to get this right. And we just make sure that organizations know and say, are you agreeing that you will do proper comms? You will make sure the FTE is there for the leaders, for these people. We spell it out. And we have say, we're not ready. And I admire them for that. And this isn't just about us getting business, so we're fine with that. However, I am worried, I'm going to be honest, in general, how we're all going to become legally compliant when we are too exhausted and overworked, executive teams, which is a psychosocial risk, to do it properly. We're going to get there, but it's the beginning of a journey.
Totally. Well, let's go into the final phase, almost final phase of the risk management process, which is you've identified your hazards, you've assessed the risks and prioritized them, and now you want to do something about it and put those controls in place. So maybe you can share, what's the definition of a control? Give us some common examples of controls that you have seen working in the real world and that really makes an impact.
Yeah, sure. And I sometimes use the word mitigations, controls, depends which environment you're working in. Yeah, so I use those words synonymously. Sorry about that. So one of the examples is what we talked about before, changing people's break times. That is a control measure. Like we said, talking about changing rosters so that people on shift work get a weekend off every once in a while. Those are types of mitigators. I saw one organization where they realized that the poor communication for their regions, I think I mentioned this before, was a real issue. And so they created a comms plan just for the regional teams, a completely different comms plan. And they gave one of their comms people 1 day a week to do special work with the regions. And saw a really good change. So there's so many different, I've got crazy examples. One of them was an office with flickering fluorescent lights that was driving about 9 people crazy, and all they wanted was the lights to be fixed. It's not always that easy, but that's how wide the range is. You definitely see some bullying and harassment. I mean, there are processes you have to follow, and all HR teams know what those processes are. What I am finding that's really encouraging is that, because bullying and harassment is scary. People are afraid to come forward. And if they don't come forward, it's hard to start the processes, right? What is really cool about psychosocial risks is when people see on the register that a lot of people, that a lot of people are experiencing it. But when they realize they're not alone, people start coming forward and the organization can do something more. So it's still the same processes you'd follow, but you've got more help from the ground in doing it.
Does that mean that employees have a right to ask for the dashboard or the overall results to be shared?
Yeah, that's a new thing. Like I think, yes, they have a right legally. Does it say anywhere? And how do you fit that into HR? I'm not 100% sure, but I think you absolutely have to share the results to some degree. The raw data, we don't even give the raw data to the management team because we don't ever want them to go around a line and figure out who said something. So we don't provide anything that's lower than an N count of 4. However, I believe all employees have a right to see the results at a high level, but nobody should be seeing them at a low N count that could identify someone.
Absolutely. I think this is something that for a lot of people, just even sharing something like this might, and in the context of maybe organizations that are not psychologically safe, is hard to even get them to be honest about sharing what they're truly being impacted by. So anything that would threaten any sense of confidentiality is a big no-no in running this process. And, yes, it's helpful to get aggregate data, but have to be very clear that, nothing identifiable. That makes sense. And so let's say some of these controls have been put in place. What are examples of changes in behavior or culture or even employee engagement that demonstrate to you that the control is effective?
Yeah. So I'm going to be honest, we have less experience in this because we don't have many organizations that have gotten that far down the track. Because some of us, we do have some that are getting to that 4 or 5 year mark, which is enough to see. Okay, so I'll give you an example. We've had some where we've found that it's not working. Like they put focus time in for people. Okay, just here's an example of, so people were saying that they never had time to think. Cognitive switching is the psychosocial risk for this one. And they just wanted time to be able to focus on one thing. And so something called focus time was put in for one organization, which I've seen work really well for some, and nobody used it. And so we had in about 4 months, okay, why aren't they using it? Go back and talk to people. And in the end, the reason they weren't using it is because the director wasn't respecting it, sorry. And when the director would see it in people's calendars, he'd still call people. So we had to go back and say, okay, but it was really just because he wasn't looking in their calendars and he got so busy, and it wasn't that he purposely didn't want to respect it. So we worked on that and got the director to look at calendars first, and it worked. This was an organization that wasn't too big. So that's just an example. But I guess what I'm really keen to do is be able to see, has a culture actually changed around psychosocial risks? And that takes a lot of impact modeling, a lot of impact evaluation, which we are only just starting with some organizations. But I feel like in a couple of years, we're going to have some data on that.
Interesting. So what would you say is an average period of time an organization needs to allow to play out to be able to see the impact of the work that they're doing?
It just depends on what you put in place. For that example with the factory workers, we saw an immediate impact, and even accidents going down, which is something that they kind of noticed later. Whether we could perfectly correlate to that, we don't know. So in some of them, it's immediate. For others, it could take a little bit longer because you might have to try a few things. But culture change is a tricky thing. What does it mean, right? You have to define it first. So that really high-level stuff can take years, and it takes a lot of money to measure. But I think in one group, one role group where you've made one change, you can sometimes see a difference in 3 months, maybe even sooner.
Yes. And so when you talk about making a change in one group or in one role, like you said, you're really talking more that work design. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not just work design though. So because it could be a management thing. So for example, we had one group where a team felt that the manager was favoring some people over the other. It's awkward. It was a hard one. And so we put some things in place, and the manager didn't want it to be like that. So there were some things put in place to try and help the manager be more aware. There were never any meetings just with the manager and one person. It was more with a group. That might not work for all groups. So it's not always design is my point. Sorry. It is sometimes the social factors. So that's an example of a social factor. An example of a work design, I guess it would be the factory workers one, the rosters, the shift stuff. Plant and equipment. We have one factory once where the plant and equipment was really bad in one factory and not another. And some people always had to work in the factory that had the poor equipment, but they didn't have the money to put new equipment in. So what do? Give people a chance to work in the factory with the good equipment and share it up a bit. So there's a design thing that just required some cleverness, not necessarily money.
And, I guess now that we've kind of run through the process of the 4 key stages of psychosocial risk management, are there any major differences we should consider in the context of company size?
Yeah, so there's pros and there's things that are easy about bigger organizations is you can always find trends with high end counts, and you can find something to work on fast. But you've got to have tools. It's really hard to know what your trends are unless you have a tool. If it's a big organization, a smaller organization, you might not need the tool, but it can also be really tricky because you might only have one person in a role. Which is exactly why the tool might not work. And so how do you do anonymity? So in those cases, it is often better to just talk to the people. But in that case, you need to make sure that whoever's doing it is trained well.
Great. So what are the tips and tricks that you have to ensure that there's, effective psychosocial risk management for any organization that's interested to do this regardless of their size?
Yeah. So the first thing is commitment for the top to some degree. It doesn't have to be heaps and heaps of money. It has to be an understanding of what it entails and a commitment to finish. The second thing is one person who can own it in the organization is a huge tip. The people space in work is very complicated right now, right? We have diversity and inclusion teams. We have health and safety teams. We have people and culture leads, and then we have HR leads. And sometimes these things are very siloed. It's very important to get one person who's going to drive the psychosocial risks from the beginning to the end and make sure that it happens. That's the second tip. And then the third tip is train your managers on soft skills.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that in itself is a hazard, right? If you don't have good leadership and management skills. So it's definitely a key one to work on. So do you have any lead and lag indicators demonstrating effective measurement of the psychosocial risk?
It's the ones that take a long time to see are the high level culture change. The ones that you can see quite quickly are specific things that happen that you put in place for specific things for small teams. But as far as how to know, it just comes back to talking to your people. You've got to ask your people, but sometimes the noise is there whether you ask them or not. So one of the biggest indicators is that noise around something has stopped.
I guess it makes me think of another question, which is maybe the control that is being put in place is actually working, but maybe the way we're measuring success of that is that a factor at all?
Oh, it's huge. Like monitoring and evaluating things is a science in itself. You first got to define what success looks like. And I'm sure we all know that, but in itself is an art. So I think that's the area that most haven't got into yet because they're just trying. Most aren't even identifying yet. So most are just focusing on identifying, assessing. But then when you get into the measurement side, you have got to define what success looks like. Then you have to define what are the indicators that you'll see that this is working, and then how will you measure them, just like any other evaluation. Yeah.
And so how often should an organization be measuring their psychosocial risk then?
Okay, so because people get survey fatigue and because you don't want to do it too often, this is not like a pulse survey, okay? Because this isn't necessarily a moment in time. This is asking, are you experienced to these tasks or these things happening in your job? How often are you experiencing them? So in most cases, a pulse survey is not the answer at all. However, we're thinking once or twice a year. That's what we're seeing is plenty. There's pros and cons to overdoing it and underdoing it, but here's the big clincher. If you're going through change management, a restructure, anything like that, it changes the risk profile for the whole organization, and you need to redo it with about 20% into the restructures where we find you get the best data.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I think what we're seeing with the fast pace of change, even if you think about the role of AI in the last 1 to 2 years and how much it's disrupted the way people work, and our approach is to try to think about how do you do it more frequently without causing survey fatigue, as you said, because so much can change, even though acknowledging that some of these hazards actually are quite stable. Like, for example, shift work is not going to change in 1 year or 2 years, for example.
It's going to take a while for most organizations to get here, but the answer is micro communities within the organization. Groups is where you do it. So if management changes for a group, you're going to need to redo the assessment about 3 or 4 months into that manager being there. If a system or a job task change, then you're going to want to redo it for that group, right? But you don't want to redo it for the whole organization every year, every 3 months if not needed, which is why you need to get your team leaders and your managers involved so that they know when it's right to redo it.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. So what have you seen, that has worked well in sort of generating that buy-in from the top as well as across the organization?
I hate to say this, but I find that when an expert comes in and says it, they listen. And when they find out they're going to get a dashboard with benchmarking that you can benchmark against other industries, that is what gets them the most over. I didn't plan on creating a tool. I thought a tool for well-being. You're taking the human out of it, but it is actually what's working. And when executive teams are shown a reality check of what it's going to take by an expert that links it to legal responsibilities, and then shows them that they're going to have a dashboard that's going to tell them where to start and be able to benchmark, they are on board.
Yeah, totally. I think it's kind of the you don't make the health changes until your doctor tells you that you need to make some health changes.
Yeah, it can be so hard when you're in the organization. It's a shame because we hire people for those expert skills, and then sometimes they want to hear it from the outside. But there are more and more consultants in this area and people that will come in. And what we do, we can't do it for too many people, but we will come in for 30 minutes for free and just talk to exec teams to try and help that person. And you can get a sense whether it's worth if or not. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like when you think about, being able to say that they have been effective ultimately in reducing harm, do we think also about needing to measure the employee's mental health, as a way of proving that it's truly reduced harm?
I think that's good. That's when the gray area comes in. Like employees' mental health is so linked to what's happening outside of work. But there are ways that this tool can see, not specifically people by name, but can tell if you have a lot of vulnerable workers or not. There's things like that, that can be told. But I think people can have mental health issues that are not coming from work. So I think there's ways to do it, but I don't think it's the right path.
Yeah, how do we tease out the work versus personal impacts, right, on an individual?
Use the tools to just go, are they experiencing things less? And are they saying they can handle the stress more? If those two things are happening, you're winning.
You're on the right track, absolutely. So, one of the other terms that we haven't introduced is sort of what's the difference between psychosocial safety and is it the same as psychological safety? So that's, I guess, the final term we're going to introduce today.
Yeah, I mean, they're very linked, but psychological safety is basically a climate where people feel safe to speak up, to share concerns, to question, to bring ideas. It fosters trust. It's a state, right? Psychosocial risk management is a tool that you use to create psychological safety. Right? I don't believe that psychosocial safety is the right word to use. People are starting to use that. It's psychological safety that comes from managing your psychosocial risks. But in the end, they're completely linked.
Perfect. Well, are there any other real world examples, Dana, that you want to share that we haven't talked about that will help our audience really understand this topic and what to do?
I guess what I just want to share is just I have been blown away by how excited workers have been about this. When you go out and you ask them, they see this as much more black and white, makes a lot more sense than about well-being. They're kind of tired of being asked about their mental health. They're having fruit bowls put down on the table and stuff. They're actually really excited when someone says, what about work is causing stress? And they see that people are listening, even if it's the smallest change. And we're just getting so many workers saying this is so much better than the old school well-being programs, which just in general is exciting. I think we're really shifting on how we do things in a positive way.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening and catch you on the next one.